The Family of Wilfred Jennett and Julia Hall, Part 2, The Children Leave the Nest. See Part 1 for the first part of the story. Wilfred Jennett had died in 1900, leaving his wife Julia with 2 adult children, Mabel, aged 21, and George, aged 19, and 2 young children, Lillian, aged 7, and Alfred, aged 8. At that time, Mabel and George were working and, as was customary, probably giving their mother the money to help support the family. Mabel was the first to leave the nest. She married Hormidas, also known as Arthur, Prince, on January 1st, 1903 in Nashua, Hillsborough, New Hampshire. He was a drunkard and a shady horse trader. Mabel worked as a shoe stitcher and later as a waitress, probably not because she needed to feel fulfilled, but to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. By 1914, she'd had enough, and the divorce was finalized in 1917. She married Felix Hamlin in 1920. He had lost his wife 6 years earlier and still had 3 children ages 17, 15, and 13 living with him when he brought his new bride home. At the time, he was renting a home and working as a master machinist at the box factory. Perhaps they met when she waited on his table. While Mabel had married first in the Methodist Church, perhaps while she was married to Arthur, a French-Canadian, she had converted to Catholicism, and she met Felix there. Since the marriage was performed by a priest, she was most likely a practicing Catholic. The marriage seemed to be good for both Felix and Mabel. Felix bought a house that was worth about $5,000, and Mabel no longer had to work outside the home. While she had no children of her own, when she died, a, quote, daughter, actually a stepdaughter, and, quote, daughter-in-law, widow of her stepson, along with grandchildren and nieces, all Hamlin connections, were listed as her survivors. She was active in her community, and a lot of her service was focused on veterans. Felix had registered for the World War I draft in 1918, but he was probably not called up because he was missing his thumb on his right hand. He'd probably lost it in an accident while working as a machinist at the International Paper Box Company. However, Mabel's brother George enlisted on June 29, 1916, which was probably part of Mabel's inspiration to get involved with the Veterans Organization. George married a month after Mabel's first marriage on February 16, 1903. He was working as a salesman, which might have brought him to Boston, where he met Elizabeth Marie Price, aged 21, living with her parents at 860 Huntington Avenue. She'd been born in England, and George might have been entranced by her accent. She had immigrated with her family from England to Canada, and then she had migrated south, ending up in Boston. At the time of the marriage, Elizabeth was not working. Financially, the couple was not doing well. They'd been married 8 years, and even though George had been working steadily, most recently as a mechanic and an electrician, they were living in a lodging house and had no children. Elizabeth was not working, and without a home of her own or children, she probably filled her time with socializing and participating in community organizations. The marriage appears to have broken down. In 1912, George took rooms in the same home where his brother Alfred was boarding. They were both working at the paper mill. When George volunteered with Company K of the 103rd Infantry on June 28, 1916, and when he sailed out from New York on September 27, 1917, he named his sister, Mrs. Jack, also known as Lillian, Field, as the person to contact in case of emergency, not his wife. But perhaps things improved, for George listed Mrs. G.H., Elizabeth, Jennett as his wife and next of kin living in Allston, Massachusetts, on his return to the United States. And there was Elizabeth with the crowd at the Nashua train station waiting to welcome the wounded hero home. George had served honorably and was awarded the Purple Heart. But George was not well. In 1923, he checked into the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, where he stayed for 4 months while he was being treated for tuberculosis. Elizabeth was living in Winthrop, Massachusetts at the time. By 1925, George was again in Nashua and again without Elizabeth. Perhaps they separated, or perhaps Elizabeth had passed away. Around 1935, George checked into the Veterans Hospital in New York, and in 1940 he was at the Veterans Administration Reservation in Kennebec, Maine. Elizabeth was deceased before he was discharged. While George was being treated for TB in 1923, he probably had been exposed to mustard gas during the war, which likely resulted in, quote, shortness of breath, persistent cough, expectorations, and chest tightness, unquote. These symptoms may have been responsible for his subsequent admissions to the Veterans Health Facilities. The first national home for disabled volunteer soldiers was built in 1866 in Toga Springs, Maine. They were created to assist Union veterans of the Civil War, and later they admitted veterans from other conflicts. Quote, men were issued blue uniforms and loosely followed Army regulations. Upon admission, each veteran was given a member number and assigned to a company. A company sergeant oversaw each company. The days were regulated with bugle calls, waking the men in the morning, calling them to the dining hall, and putting them to sleep at night. Over time, the homes came to offer recreational activities and libraries, and churches were built. According to the 1900 Board of Managers Annual Report, several homes maintained theaters, libraries, and billiard halls. At some of the homes, members engaged in activities such as dominoes, checkers, chess, backgammon, cards, boating, skating, pool, and croquet. At the home's theaters, veterans were entertained with concerts, comedies, melodramas, musicals, vaudeville, and lectures. Of the 8 homes run in 1900, 6 had suitable chapels, and all 8 held Protestant and Catholic services. The homes were built on 100 or more acres of land, quote, far enough away from the closest town to keep the veterans away from vices, unquote. Quote, each national home branch contained barracks, a dining hall, a hospital, a cemetery, and recreational facilities. The types of recreational facilities offered included beer halls, parks, lakes, zoos, theaters, and libraries. In addition to recreational opportunities, the men could work during the day to make additional money. Most of the branches had farms that employed the members and provided food for them to eat. Other branches offered jobs such as working in a shoe factory or at a printing press. After leaving the Veterans Administration Reservation in Maine, George returned to Nashua. He worked at Henry's Diner on Main Street for a few years before he moved in with his sister Mabel and her husband Felix Hamlin. Again, George's health failed, and he checked into the Veterans Hospital in Newington, Connecticut, where he remained for several years before his death. Mabel's experience with the veterans groups probably helped her as she submitted a request for a headstone. While none of the other family members in the Woodlawn Cemetery plot have markers, Mabel made sure George got everything his service had entitled him to receive. Lillian was the next to marry. She and John William Field tied the knot on November 13, 1915, in Nashua, Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Like her sister Mabel, Lillian must have converted to Catholicism in order to be married by the priest. They rented a home at 10 Canal Street. John worked as a telephone repairman, and Lillian worked as a waitress. They also took in 2 boarders to help make ends meet. Their marriage was interrupted by John's service in World War I, but once they were reunited, John went back to his job as a telephone repairman, and Lillian took care of their home, this time without needing to care for boarders. They had no children, and Lillian died in 1948 after a lengthy illness. Alfred left Nashua in 1914 and was living in Boston, eventually working at the counter of the Waldorf lunchroom. He claimed to be married when he reported to the draft board on June 5, 1917, but he claimed that his marriage in 1922 was his first. Alfred was working as a brakeman, and Lucilia Wilson was a shoe worker when they married on October 21, 1922. She was divorced with a daughter aged 13 and a son aged 12. They went to Hartford, Connecticut, and returned to Boston in 1931. By 1940, they were separated. Alfred continued to work for the railroad in Boston and died childless in 1960. He was the last of Wilfred Jennett and Julia Hall's children. Out of the 4 children who survived to adulthood, none had children of their own. Now only Mabel was left, and she probably arranged for transporting Alfred's body to Nashua to be interred in the family plot at the Woodland Cemetery. With the exception of Mabel and Lillian, who are buried with their husbands, the whole family is there.